What is up, brothers and sisters? Welcome to the Mitch Gray Show. So excited to bring another awesome episode to you. And I say it every single time. At one point, I got really frustrated at myself for saying that our episodes are so awesome, but they are. So I'm going to say it every time. We have another great guest that I've had the honor of meeting and spending a little time with. Welcome to the show, Eliza. Make sure I get this right, VanCort.
Eliza VanCort. Yep.
Did it. Yes. Sometimes I have people on, it's like, oh, that's pronounced this way. No, it's not.
Well, actually, it is Eliza, and most people say Eliza. And I never used to correct them. And now I'm all about people's names being said correctly. So I correct the name as well.
Yes, you have to have the E. I think sometimes, though, that's also an accent thing, like depending on where you are. I'm kind of from the South, and so Eliza is easy to say, but I know some people from other parts of the country, they don't ever say an E hardly. And so, yeah. Yeah. Awesome.
Yeah,
welcome to the show, Eliza.
Things. I never thought about it that way.
Yeah. Well, welcome to the show. We're so happy to have you on. How are you?
I'm good. I mean, okay, it's COVID. It's 2020. Yeah. I am good, 2020 good, but no one's totally happy right now because, there's a lot of suffering going on in the world. But all things considered, I'm doing pretty well.
Awesome. Yeah, we're going to get into that a little bit. I have a feeling today in our conversation. So, but I have to ask, when people go to your website, ElizaVanCort.com, we'll put that in the show notes. There's this adjective that you use that I love, and it's space maker. What in the world is a space maker? That's the question. Ready, set, go.
I think you might be actually thinking about space claimer.
Oh, space claimer. I messed it up.
Claimer. But it's close. It's actually kind of similar.
Maybe we should add one, space maker, as well.
Space maker? Well, I guess if you are claiming space, you're making space for yourself and others. So perhaps those go together. Well, basically, I wrote a book, which I'm contractually not allowed to talk about a lot of the stuff in the book yet, but I can tell you the title and the general idea behind it. It's actually available for pre-sale on Amazon. So, but I can't tell you about it, so you probably don't want to buy it right now. But it's called A Woman's Guide to Claiming Space. Stand tall, raise your voice, be heard. And to claim space is basically to live the life of your choosing, bravely and unapologetically. And claiming space as a woman can be difficult. If you're a woman of color, it can be even more difficult. And so the book really is about how to claim space. And that was, I spent a year writing about how to do that. And there are 5 different ways you can do it. And it's a book with actionable tools that teaches you how to do that. So it's not just this theoretical conversation about what is claiming space. This is what claiming space is. And now we're going to take an entire book to tell you how to do that.
Yeah, that's interesting. So a few questions come to mind. Number one, as a guy, if I see a book, Claiming Space, Stand Tall, Raise Your Voice and Be Heard, that is a woman's guide to claiming space. As a guy, if I read that book, I'm trying to figure out how to shape this question since we can't get into the nitty gritty of the book yet.
Well, maybe we can get into the general,
So what would your thoughts be as a male, the reflective points from A Woman's Guide to Claiming Space, as a male who would potentially read that book?
Right. That's a really interesting question. And at first I used to say, well, men are kind of used to being centralized. And so the question I often get is, well, what is this for me? And, my first answer was, well, it's not for you. But then and that's okay. But now actually I've had a lot of men who have been pre-readers of the book. And I've had women as well, but I've also had men. And there's been 2 different categories of men. The white men have found that the book has given them insight into the experience of women. And it's really helped them if they're fathers, if they're husbands, if they have, anybody who intersects with a woman has said, wow, suddenly I understand my mother better, So I think that's a really powerful thing because we can't really live in somebody's experience, but we can read about it. And that's how, we tell our stories that's how we understand each other. So I think that's one thing. Men of color have said there's a lot of intersectionality and that some of the book is not for them. And they are the first to say, I really realized some of this book's not for me, and that's okay. But then and they've said, I've gained a lot of insight into women, but then some of them have also said, some of this book is really for anybody who faces an ism. And they found it incredibly useful. Some of it was very gender specific, but some of it's really for anybody who's dealing with any kind of pushback because of something about them, their physicality, how they present, that they can't change. And so I think it's a universal book, and I think it has the potential to really make an impact. I'm really excited about it, actually.
Yeah. Yeah. The
And, I got to say one thing about, oh, go ahead.
Go ahead. No, go ahead. Go ahead.
No, I mean, the one thing I have to say, because I feel it would be wrong not to, is this book is a village of people who created this book. I wrote the book, but I have an army of people behind me that read the book, that gave feedback on the book. I have women, I almost called the book Conversations in the Bathroom, because some of it was inspired. The women's bathroom is a magical place. Yes. It's magical. And so unless you're a trans woman, in which case, we have to change that. We have to allow trans women, obviously, into the women's bathroom. But because that's just appalling that they're not allowed to enjoy that incredible magical space for women. But if you are in the women's bathroom, you'll go up to a woman and say something in the women's bathroom you won't say anywhere else. And I almost called the book Conversations in the Bathroom. And what this really does is it takes those things that women from my seminars and talks who didn't want to say these things during the Q&A publicly came to me in the bathroom and asked me the questions. And I just sort of took those conversations and put them into the sunlight.
Yeah, it's interesting. As a creator, especially a writer, you're always looking for those small magical moments of opportunity, right? And that's exactly what you're talking about. It's like you gather all these pieces of a story and then start bringing it together as the whole. And I find myself doing that as a writer quite often. It's like, wow, that really impacted me, or that impacted someone else. And it's like, note to self, remember that, because that's something that's powerful and usable. Yeah, so it's really amazing that that's kind of what sounds like inspired a lot of how this book is written and crafted. And yeah.
Yeah, that's definitely a big part of it. I mean, it was sort of an intersection of my personal journey and then all the women who have spoken to me in my career, including my acting students, because I have this kind of eclectic background of political science and acting. And so it was really just listening to people and hearing their stories. And the amazing thing is, same story, different facts over and over and over and over again. It's pretty easy to figure out what to put in the book because I kept hearing the same stories over and over again.
Yeah, I like to tell people all the time, humanity is humanity. And the story is really the same. The details, like you said, the facts change and are exchangeable. But the basic story of humanity is the story of humanity. And it's almost like it's written into our DNA. And then we get to have our own experiences within that story. And that's an incredible thing. Well, I have to say, I didn't tell you this before when we were talking pre-show, but as a dad of 2 daughters who are now grown adults, who are also African-American, I'm very excited to read this book because I think you're right. When you can put yourself into the ideology of someone that you can't necessarily relate with, it really changes perspective. And so thank you for investing in that. I think that's a wonderful thing.
I really think it's important to highlight the voices of all women. And in fact, the final, without saying what it's about, but the final aspect, the final of the 5 aspects of the book, the final chapter of that particular part, I seeded my space, and I have a lot of young women of color who I mentor as a Cookhouse Fellow at Cornell University. And I actually ask them some questions because often our youth aren't in books. We quote experts.
Right.
And so that we never get to hear from the next generation because they're not an expert, but they're actually an expert at their own experience. So I wanted their voices, and particularly young women of color, they're made to be invisible by white people, by me, by people who just do not regard them as they would their white counterparts. And so what I did is I asked them, I asked them some questions in a text thread, and just to get some guidance from them. And their answers were so brilliant. I said, hey, can I take these and just put them at the end of my book and just step away and let your voices close out the final part of the book? And they said yes. And what they have to say is so brilliant and so beautiful. It it chokes me up talking about it. It's really amazing.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, what's crazy is that there's almost two demographics of people that we avoid outside of the kind of obvious ones that we're talking about, people of color and women. But there's kind of two other demographics that we often avoid, and it's young people and older people. It's almost like once people hit 75, we forget about them. And before they hit 30, we don't want to hear from them. And it's like, are you kidding me? Like, you think about what I love about young people. I spent a lot of time in youth ministry, and I've spent years in mental health work with teenagers. And what I love about teenagers is their curiosity and their honest perspective. They don't really care when they finally get to share their feelings. They don't care what people think. And you can give them that safe space. And that's almost, it sounds like that's exactly what you witnessed when you just gave them a platform.
Yeah. Oh yeah. I mean, my own kids, the people that I mentor, I always say, I think they teach me a lot more than I teach them.
Yes.
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely.
And then that older generation is such a treasure trove of shoulds and shouldn'ts and woulds and couldn'ts. And we're missing that. Yeah, it's crazy to me.
And I think it's actually amplified with women because women, so much of their social capital is derived by their looks. You know, how somebody looks, women get a huge, I mean, pretty privilege is real for men and women, but it's much more powerful for women. And historically, it used to be if you were a white woman back in, you know, not that long ago, your entire life was dependent on how good looking you were, because if you were good looking, you were lucky enough to get a man who had a profession. And that historical memory has completely continued. And so I think that when women get to an age where they're no longer considered beautiful by the standards that we put in this society, which are insane, but whatever, they become invisible to many people. And it's a shame because older people they have more wisdom than we do. They have a lot to share. And we need to make sure, I always talk to my kids about the importance, you know, of listening to people who have more experience. I had a wonderful teacher in high school, Jim Scarpula, who said, you know, you shouldn't have to learn everything from experience. You know, some of it should be from listening to people who have experienced things that you don't want to, and then learning from them. And I think sometimes we feel like we have to learn everything from experience, and there are things we can avoid just by listening, really.
It's interesting you say that. When I was a teenager, I had a man tell me a similar piece of advice. And the advice he gave was, the smartest people in the world learn from other people's mistakes.
That's right.
That's always resounded. And it's a very similar ideology that, you know, you'll observe and listen and ask questions. You can learn so much from others that is incredible.
Yeah,
so
and in general, I'm sorry, but our society in general in America, we have such a youth-oriented culture in many ways. If you go to places in Asia, for example, I was in Hong Kong working, you know, there's just so much more respect for elders there. It's stunning. You know, I mean, they get the people defer to them because they think they have wisdom to share. And I think we really need to do more of that in this country for sure.
Yeah, it's very similar. I spent a lot of my teenage years on the Navajo reservation, and in the indigenous cultures, it's very much the same way. You know, the elders of the community are regarded as sacred, and you protect them and you listen to them, and so, but for the most part, you're right. In our modern American situation, we kind of just shove them aside and stick them in these other buildings that no one goes and visits. And it's sad. We just forget about them. But yeah, when you said that a while ago, I thought, hold on a second, there's something that's really valuable there. And I love what you're saying about the woman's perspective and what has happened, especially to white women, because for so many years, and it still is to this day. I had a conversation with a lady the other day. We were talking about how so many people put their investment and their value in outer appearance. Well, the reason they do that is because we've built a society that has told you have to look a certain way. And so,
go ahead.
Yeah, we're just meeting the ramifications of that. That now we have a generation that has totally valued themselves on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think Black women face that in some ways a double whammy, right?
Because 100%, yes.
you know, they have the standard of beauty, and then they also have the standard of whiteness that has been held up as this crazy ideal, which is just, you know, ridiculous. And luckily that is changing. But yeah, white, you know, women of color, working class white women have always been working, you know. Yes. But if you were a upper middle class woman or upper class woman, that was, you know, your looks were really important because you were not expected to work. So, but there were obviously, you know, as a friend of mine said, who studies Black women, she said, well, you know, white women may have had a gilded cage, but Black women and, you know, working class white women were just trying to survive, you know. So I think white women had a little better, a lot better, but it's still oppressive nonetheless.
Yeah, reflecting back on when my girls especially were younger, I can't count how many times we had to tell people, you don't come up and touch their hair. You don't do that to anyone else. And people don't think about those little things, but that is a signification of exactly what you're talking about. That we would just be in a store and some strange person would just come up and want to touch their hair. And it's like, you're not doing that to anyone else. Like, what's happening here? You know, and we did our best to use it as a passageway to a different conversation. Right. But at the same time, it's just incredible that you even have to do that. Like it would never cross my mind in the store to walk up to someone and just touch their hair. And it would happen to the girls all the time.
Well, I mean, it's that we are taught as white people that what's mine is mine and what's yours, if you are a person of color, is mine. So I mean, we enslaved people. We owned them. We could do whatever we wanted, you know? And so unfortunately, you know, that historic memory has continued in some ways, such as that, you know. I mean, it still stuns me, the stories that my friends who are Black women tell me about having, you know, people touching their children or touching their bellies when they were pregnant. No one would have come up and touched my child without my permission. No way, not in a million years. But, you know, my Black women friends have said, they've got to say, no, you know, I'm sorry. And then they get all kinds of other stuff as well. I mean, I have a friend who had 3 little boys, and she was a Black woman, and she's on the floor and they're crawling all over her like children do to their mommies. And this person said, oh, look at the little monkeys crawling all over you. And she said, she's so good. She teaches this stuff. So of course she was ready. And she just looked at them with a smile and said, I think you're going to have to find another word, which is a great way to handle it. But, you know, it's that same sort of thing that's just pervasive, and you're always fighting against that tide. You know, as white parents, there's a whole world that we just don't deal with unless, of course, we are a white parent with children of color, and then it's very different. Yeah,
that you're exactly right. And gosh, when you just said what those people said to that lady, my heart just sunk because we've been there. And I always tell people, when you're a white guy, especially witnessing some of those things, it shakes you. I mean, because of the things you've just said. There is a culture and a historical voice that echoes through the soul of people that have been oppressed and suppressed and abused and owned.
And who have oppressed.
Yes. And going back to your kind of platform specifically, it's time that changes for women in general across the board, whether they be white or people of color or whatever. But it's just, I'm sure you have felt the challenge of bringing that voice, that conversation to the table. So what does that look like? I want to go there first. What does it look like when you were able to go speak with people quite a few months ago?
Back in the day.
Back in the day, right? What did that look like when you were speaking to an audience, whether it was a blended male-female audience or just well, let's go there. That actually came to mind. Did you get a different reception, male-female audience comparative to a female-only audience?
It was really interesting, actually. Partly it was because of the work that I do. Often I would have a disproportionately female audience because people can opt to come see my talks. But what I found to be really interesting is that when I, for example, give a talk on communication, and my talk is really about actionable steps on how to communicate and stand in your power. It's in my book, it's what I do, it's what my coaching is what my seminars are about, and it's really hands-on stuff. Some of the stuff is universal. So for example, volume. There's some gender specific stuff with volume, that's probably not the best example, but there are some things that are just absolutely really universal. And then there are some things that are quite specific. For example, cadence, how quickly or how slowly you speak. This is very gender specific. I would say, okay, so for the men this, and for the women this, you know, so, and I would start the talk by saying, you know, you can't talk about issues of communication without addressing issues of race and gender and all of our isms, because our communication is impacted by our isms, of course, right? And so people would then come up to me afterwards and say, or they would remark in the talks, you know, like once in a while a man would say, wow, you spent a lot of time talking about women. And, you know, we'd often be staying in a group and all the women would say, no, she just said men this and women this. You're just not used to the fact that usually you don't mention women at all. And so for me, that was always an amazing experience, that I wanted to make sure everybody, you know, all genders were heard and all of them got feedback that would work for them. But so much of the time with communication coaching and a lot of other work, I mean, if you look at the studies that are done, they're largely done on men. You know, men are so centralized that when you say 50% of the time you're talking about women, it feels like they're talking about women most of the time when I'm just simply not. So in my idea, you know, sometimes I am asked to do talks just for women, but, and I also do anti-racist communication talks. So there are things where kind of are more specialized, but a lot of the more general talks that I give are just really about how to communicate effectively and powerfully. And men often have a really visceral reaction to the fact that I'm calling out the differences. It's really interesting. But on the other hand, some of the men come up to me or say in the Q&A, wow, I feel like I've learned so much about how to be a better boss. I didn't realize I was doing these power plays to people, but now I heard you and I realize I am, and I'm gonna do X, Y, and Z, and thank you so much. And that's actually most of the time. Most people are really excited to learn these tips. But there are people who get it really, you know, because it's just so different. We're just so used to certain voices being centralized and certain experiences being centralized.
Right. It's almost like Christmas shopping. Okay, go with me here. A lot of men back in the day were, oh, we have to go Christmas shopping again. It's like, bro, you go once a year, get over it.
Yes, right? That is so true.
And so the conversation, you bring up any little thing about women or something that they don't want, it's like, oh, that's all we talked about. It's like, for 10 minutes, that's all we talked about. Right. Come on, we're here for an hour.
Literally, I said for men, for women, and you were like, wow, you talked about women a lot. It's like, no, 50%. Probably less. I mentioned the differences. That's
right,
cool.
Right. I love that.
I don't blame people for that. I really don't. And I don't get offended. I think that it's simply that we are trained, you know, that is literally what people get.
Yes.
They get, I mean, when you look at a communication talk, I cannot tell you how many clients come to me who are women, or they are men of color, and, or, you know, white women, women of color, men of color. And they say, you know, I went to this communication talk and I got worse. And I don't understand, like I've been getting worse. So I heard that I should talk to you. And I said, well, you know, that's because most communication talks talk about every person, but really they're talking about what works for white men. Yes. And so some of the tips for white men are really useful for white men, and they're actually worse for white women.
Right.
And so, you know, it's really fascinating. I could go on and on, but it's really fascinating to me what we expect and how we react when we don't get that.
Yes, there is a sense of innocence and ignorance for many people, because they've never been confronted with this idea that what you're doing, even maybe out of sincerity, is not the right thing to be doing.
Right.
And that's across all boards, but I do see that often when you're dealing with women and men, and now in our culture, thankfully, you're dealing with, you know, transgender, or what we could go down the list of things that have changed for the good. But that gap, even though I think it is closing, it's still, the chasm is so wide. And I think it is because of ignorance more than it is being a jerk. I think a lot of people are just ignorant.
I agree. And I don't even think of it as ignorance. I mean, I guess it is, but I think of it more as programming. I mean, I'm a total sci-fi nerd. I'm the word. You're going to hear so many sci-fi references. I'm the worst nerd. But, I think of it like the Matrix.
Yes.
When you're in the Matrix, you have no idea you're in the Matrix. You don't know that you're doing these things. You're just plugged in. And it's until you're unplugged, you're going to keep doing the thing you've always done. And can you blame those, people? Absolutely not. And it's, our job, I think, as people who are trying to disrupt certain patterns that aren't working for all of society, is to just help people realize, hey, you're in the Matrix. Let's do things differently, and not put shame or blame on that. Because I think that's what makes people really shut down and not listen.
What keeps kind of echoing within me as you're telling this story and the powerful work that you do is the small act that we were taught in the South, and I think most young boys are taught, is that you open the door for girls. But I remember as a kid being taught that, but it was taught not from a standpoint of really just politeness. It was actually taught with a subliminal message of they're inferior. And I remember working with some teenage girls one time, and they told me, we don't like it. These are 15, 16-year-old girls. And they said, we don't like it when boys open the door for us. And I said, why? And they said, because we can open the door for ourselves. And that to me was such a powerful statement. And their meaning wasn't, we don't need men. Their meaning was, we have the power to do things ourselves, and we're tired of being made to feel like we can't.
Right. And I think that's sort of I love what you just said, because so much of this is really about just believing people's experience.
Yes.
And saying, okay, so that's what you want. That's cool. I was dating a guy, and he was a very sweet man, and he used to always open the door for me. And for him, it was just a sign to say, hey, I love you. I'm going to open this car door for you. And when he first started doing it, and he would also stand up when I came to the table. And the first time he did that, I was like, what the hell is he doing? Like, I've never even experienced this. This is just not the people that I usually hang out with. So I'm like, why are you standing? And then we're standing there once talking to somebody, and he's still standing, and he's like, are you going to sit down? And I realized he was waiting for me to sit. And then on the sidewalk, he always wanted to be toward the street. And there were all these little things that his parents had taught him, are just, to him, it was a way of saying, I love you. I think you're special. And I had to really sit with myself, and because I know the historical roots of those things,
yes.
Right? Women are weak, and men have to protect them. Women have to open the door for that, But at the same time, for me, I kind of feel like, personally, I'm going to pick my battles. And if it makes him feel good to open a door for me, and that's his way of saying, I love you, then cool. Now if another woman might say, not cool. It just really makes me feel like weak every time you do it. Then you just say, okay. But I think that's a lot of working, any kind of interaction and communication really is just about believing the person's experience and honoring it. And if I had said, listen, I really can't stand it when you open the door for me, I think you would have said, okay, cool. Right. So I think it's really, I think we have to really believe each other more and listen to each other more. And I think that's really half the battle.
Yes. It's almost like this mutual agreement of compassion has to be found. That says, I have compassion and empathy for your experience and your story, and whatever I can do to empower that, and conversely the same. And that's when we can really begin closing this gap that we're talking about. But the word that comes to mind when I talk about that is humility. There has to be a humility there that says, especially coming from a white guy, I just know in dealing with white men, there has to be a humility that says, you can't pull yourself up by your bootstraps all the time. You're not the person in charge all the time. And it's a lowering of that guard that can then lead to that compassion and conversation.
Yeah, I actually wrote an article on this on LinkedIn. It's called Mindful Ignorance. My life is Elastigirl, because as I said, I'm a nerd. But so I have a connective tissue thing that I don't really talk about. I have something called Hypermobility Syndrome, and there's an extreme of that syndrome where actually your heart can be elastic. So it's basically a thing where your connective tissue doesn't work the way other people's do, and you're very, very flexible, which sounds awesome. But for me, since I have a really mild case of it, if I don't work out every single day and do very specific exercises, as if I have injured every single connective joint in my body, I will injure every single connective joint in my body.
Oh,
And so people, I don't really talk about it a lot. And people will often say, oh, it must be so nice to spend so much time at the gym. Oh, it must be so awesome. Like you just have so much time. And I will say, well, I'm hypermobile, like, and then I'll have to explain it to them. And often people just can't quite, it's new to them. They don't understand it. So they don't believe it. So I tell the story about how I was going to get orthotics because I'm hypermobile. And this woman kept, I kept saying, oh, you got to adjust it this way, adjust it this way. And finally I said, I really appreciate you dealing with my princess and the pea kind of thing. And she said, Eliza, I have people who have hypermobility all the time in here. And I know what you go through. I have no idea what it's like, but I believe you. And I just thought, oh,
wow.
it was just like, okay, this feels great. And I think that's the same thing with isms and with just any kind of communication. And, the extension of that story is I was talking to one of my girlfriends once, and she told me that I'd done something that was racist. She's a Black woman. And I started getting really defensive. And I started saying, well, no, it's because of this and this and this and this and this. And she said, Eliza, I need to stop you right there because you're being really white right now. and I said, but she said, no. And she said, when people of color tell you about their experience and how you've impacted them, your only job is to listen and believe them.
Yes.
And I said, but. And she said, okay, now you're being even whiter. Listen, you just have to listen and believe me. And I started thinking about that. And of course, extrapolating my own experience as a woman, somebody with a hypermobility syndrome, and how I really get frustrated when people don't believe me. And that it's our job to understand that we need to be mindfully ignorant. We need to be mindful that we are ignorant. Yes. And go through life sort of saying, okay, there are things I will never understand, and I just need to believe that person and understand that I'm ignorant and that that's okay.
Yeah, that's powerful. That is so powerful to give yourself the permission to just shut up and believe what the other person is telling you. That there's so much power there. Yeah. Wow.
And it's hard to do. Because I feel bad. I don't want to do it.
Yeah, this is why we call it practice, right? Because we're practicing every day.
No, I'm not being racist. No, I'm perfectly not racist.
Right. So, Eliza, there is a reason that people arrive where they are, and there is a reason that you're so eloquently and knowledgeably bringing a voice to the conversation, specifically about women. How did you arrive here? What's the journey been like? What inspired or motivated you to go, hold on a second, this needs a voice?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's twofold. I think in my adult life, I guess I can start with my younger life and kind of very quickly summarize. But it really comes from my life experience. My mother, when I was about 4.5, became paranoid schizophrenic. And she went from this vibrant, beautiful, brilliant woman who taught English to kids in Harlem and was really innovative teacher to, not recognizing me. She was so sick at times. And she took me illegally. So I was actually considered like I was a missing person. I had a national APP out on me. And she took me from New York to Texas once, right out from under my father, and then New York to California twice, once by truck. So hitchhiking across the country from truck stop to truck stop to truck stop. And if you can imagine being a little kid with your paranoid schizophrenic mother going in trucks with men, it's not a good experience. And so I learned very quickly to be very small and to be invisible so that I would stay safe. And it took me a really long time to start realizing that being invisible isn't safe. It's quite dangerous. Right. So that was sort of the beginning of my journey. And I think there were all kinds of different things that affected me along the way that changed my perspective. Once during that time, I was in a foster care, I was in all Black neighborhood. I was the only white person. And, you know, it wasn't nearly the same as being the only Black kid in an all white neighborhood, because nobody was mean to me. Everybody was incredibly welcoming and loving, but I was the other. And that gave me a tiny, tiny insight into what that might feel like. And my foster mother was the most wonderful, incredible woman. So I think that kind of impacted me. And then eventually as an adult, I forged a life for myself. I had children. I started an acting school. This is my green room. My students, when they graduate, they sign this wall.
For those listening on audio, Eliza's background is epic. So you'll have to go to YouTube and watch the video to see it.
Yeah, we have all these students and they all sign the door when they leave. It's amazing. And it just feels like all of them, people who I love and care about, are behind me. So I often do my podcast here. But so anyway, I was, you know, I think it was about 7 years ago, 8 years ago, I was riding my bike, and I had started, and I was crossing the highway, and somebody was texting and driving, and they came out of nowhere and they hit me in the head with their car. And I got hit on one side of my head, went on the hood of their car, got knocked unconscious, got thrown into the other, thrown off the hood of the car into the middle of the intersection. I would have died, but there was a moped that actually, because I got thrown into the other lane in a grace of whatever higher power you believe in, that moped went around me, giving the other car time to stop and not run me over. But I got a bilateral brain injury. I had bleeding in my brain, not much, but it was a subdural hematoma. And I lost my ability to communicate. And I've always been a really good communicator. And so I had to learn to communicate from the ground up. Wow. And before I had been an intuitive communicator, an intuitive teacher, and I really had to learn how to deconstruct communication bit by bit. And I started watching people and thinking, what makes one person listen to and one person ignored? And, you know, what are the mechanics of this? And I went from, in the first month, you know, the entire first day, you know, every day I would live my day, I would remember it, I'd go to sleep. The next day, I'd only remember 25% of it. Wow. And so, you know, I was in really bad shape to suddenly realizing I could teach myself how to communicate again. I could learn to get back to where I was. And I think the combination of having that experience of being very small when I was younger, and then kind of deconstructing how people claim space, really sparked my passion about the work that I do. And it's you know, I love political science. It was my major in college, and I love theater. And this is an acting and teaching actors. And this is this wonderful combination of the two. But certainly, you know, the experiences I have really sucked. They weren't fun, but they made me who I am. And I think that you can take experiences and let them break you, or you can take experiences and hopefully learn from them and better yourself. So that's what I've tried to do.
Well, first of all, we're happy you're still with us.
Yeah, I
first
am.
Of all.
It was pretty scary for a while. Yeah.
Isn't it incredible that the spaces that we found safe, often as children, become the spaces of danger or insecurity as we grow? Mm-hmm. And I think we don't reflect on that enough, because oftentimes, you know, it's this old adage of, we have a dream as a kid, or we know how to survive our atmosphere or whatever. We get to third, fourth, fifth grade, and voices outside of us start telling us, oh, you could never do that. You could never be that. You need to, you know, pick something that makes more sense. And we get to middle school and we talk about in seventh grade what we want to do when we grow up. And some adult tells us, no, that'll never happen. And it's almost like those safe spaces, whether figuratively or literally, as children, in the innocence of children, actually can become the danger spaces of insecurity as we grow. And so it's almost learning how to work through that and let go of that child blankie, you know, the emotional and psychological. And that is not an easy process at all.
No, it's not. I mean, for me, my childhood wasn't very safe. And that was always kind of a flip for me, is I remember going to kindergarten and kids just freaking out because they're, you know, they didn't get the right potato chips in their lunch. And I remember thinking, how is this a big deal? Like, this is nothing. Like, we're great here, you know? So for me, I think as I got older, I learned how to, you know, I wouldn't go back to my childhood. I mean, I had some really wonderful times in my childhood. I had my father, I had my stepmother, and my mother when she was healthy, which wasn't often. But, you know, and I had some incredible women who took me into their hearts and in their homes and mentored me and kind of became my aunts. But for me, I think a lot of my passion is really helping people who have some sort of some barrier they faced, whether it be their childhood or their some sort of ism they face or anything like that. I mean, that's why I volunteer time sometimes with high school students who are at risk, because, you know, I relate.
Yes, yes. So I want to go back to those adjectives that we talked about earlier in the show that you use to define yourself, because there's one of them that when I looked at your website really stuck out to me. And I think it's a word that that needs what I like to call redeemed. Some people call it redefined. There's these words, you know, words are like gift wrapping, and there's these words that people steal and they make them evil. And it takes work to redeem those words and get them back and give them the correct power. But the adjective, the word I'm talking about is feminists. Tell us about what the work looks like when you're talking about feminists.
Right.
And tell us about the work in reclaiming that word and giving it its proper place.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm on a mission to make sure that I use that word whenever possible. I think that one thing that people do that's incredibly effective is they use certain words to label people to control them. And it's the three words that are used for women are feminist, crazy, and bitch. And within those three words, they're umbrella words that actually represent, you know, different things. So, you know, crazy is hysterical, sensitive, whatever. And then we have feminist, and then bitch is women who are angry. You know, we're not allowed to show our rage. There's a great book, if you ever want to read it, called Rage Becomes Her. I'm reading it, it's amazing. But it's all about women's rage and how it's been demonized. And feminist is about women who advocate for themselves. Feminism ultimately is the belief that women should have equal rights and opportunities.
Yes.
So, you know, if you don't believe that women should have equal rights and opportunities, cool, you're not a feminist. But if you do, you're a feminist. And by demonizing that word, it's actually a brilliant strategy. I think it's so, you know, in the way people message. If you tell people that believing in equal rights and opportunities means that you are a strident, you know, mean, whatever, militant bitch or whatever it is, then what do? You make it so they don't identify with a cause that is there to make their lives better. It's so for me, women need to we need to repurpose that word. We need to own that word. And, you know, I think we also need to make sure that we're doing feminism in a really intersectional way, because white feminism historically has been incredibly racist. You know, we threw our Black sisters under the bus so we could get the vote. You know, we have not done well, white women, with our sisters of color. And, but I think intersectionality and intersectional feminism, what I always say to people is, look, you know, if right now, if we could unite as women, we could really make some meaningful changes in the world. And feminism is about doing that. And it's about supporting each other, uplifting each other, and uplifting by extension the world, because the world can't really fly right if one wing of the world is not as strong as the other.
Yeah, that's I think that's really empowering, because we I heard someone say it this simply one time. It was a group of men talking, and one of the men was basically railing against feminists in more or less words. And a guy looked at him and goes, "You should be the strongest supporter of feminism, because if it weren't for your mom, you wouldn't be here." and I thought that was like one of the greatest things ever, because it's like, yeah, hold on a second. The power of life in the universe is female. And so what are people thinking to negate that power? But again, and you and I talked about this pre-show, it also dates back for the most part to Anglo males, white males in America specifically, and this idea of colonialism and power and supremacy. And it's like everyone calls God he. If
Right.
you study the Hebrew language, the majority of the adjectives for God were feminine, not masculine. And so it's this whole idea of robbing that life power so that you can have your own power. And so I love when you talk about that. Yeah.
I think it's so important. I mean, I think it's Tina Fey does it as well. You know, she has the bitches get shit done thing. And I actually have a mug in my house that says that. And, but it's like, to me, if someone calls somebody a bitch or a feminist or crazy, it's usually because they're stating an opinion.
Yes.
And, if someone were, I don't really get called that very often, but if someone were to say, well, that's kind of a bitchy thing to say, or that's a bitch, okay, that's cool, thanks. Because that means I just said something that had a backbone, and I'm cool with that. I'm not going to run from those words. I think a great example of this is actually when Trump said such a nasty woman in the debate. And within like a day, they had the nasty woman Facebook page. They had, nasty, I'm a nasty woman, like, things on t-shirts. It's very similar to the I'm speaking that Kamala Harris just did. It's a similar thing where we are owning these moments of oppression, or nevertheless she persisted. When Mitch McConnell said, well, nevertheless she persisted, and women went, hey, yeah, she persisted. That's awesome. Yeah. So, I have a nevertheless she persisted face mask because I thought it was so cool. And I'm a nerd, and I just like, that's so cool. But, I think that it's important if someone tries to use those words against you to do jujitsu and just say, yes, I am indeed a feminist. And if you don't believe women should have equal rights and opportunities, then I think we should probably have a conversation about that, because that's distressing.
Right. To say the least, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So let's go here as we kind of start rounding things out, Eliza. I want to give the people some actionable thoughts for a few reasons, because you obviously have a high passion level and a well of knowledge, and I think you can inspire some people to new thoughts as you do. I also want to ask these questions because I'm hoping it'll pique people's curiosity in a few months when the book comes out in the spring. So give the people some thoughts on this question. What do we do as men? What do we do as men to really, if you could have a group of 100 men and they were ready to listen and to be engaged, what would you tell them?
That's a tough one. I think I'm going to go back to what we talked about earlier. There's something that I talk about in my seminars and in my talks. Usually it comes from a Q&A question, which is, a woman will say, well, what do I do when I try to talk to a man and he says, usually, you're acting like a bitch or you're acting crazy. And I call it the, I didn't do anything wrong, you're crazy defense, now apologize. So I didn't do anything wrong, you're crazy, now apologize. So the way things usually work is the woman will say, hey, I didn't like the way that you said that. And the man will say, you're being extra sensitive, what's wrong with you? And the woman will say, I'm sorry, and apologize. And the man will say, it's okay. And then the man goes away feeling vindicated and not learning anything. And the woman goes away feeling like she's batshit bananas, excuse my language. And then it's a rinse and repeat cycle. And it happens with white people to people of color. I think one of the things you said, and I don't know the exact verbiage you used, is, what do we do when we're ready to listen?
Yes.
I think really the answer is be ready to listen. The very first thing and the most powerful thing we can do is when someone tells them something, to believe them, and then just say, what can I do differently? The example that I like to give is, we were having a conversation about something, I don't even remember what it was, and a friend of mine who's a woman of color said to another white woman, no, actually, it's not like that at all. It's like this, that's completely off track. And it was a kind of a racist undertones that the white woman had said. And the white woman looked at her and said, oh, how very white of me, thank you. And that was it.
Yeah.
And then we kept talking. And it wasn't even a blip in the conversation,
Right.
because the person said, I hear you. I realized that was kind of like, okay, cool. I won't do that. And I think that it is the same for women. So if, I think that's the first thing. The second thing is, and I can't go into it all now, but when I give talks and seminars, and I do that remotely now, and you can still learn this stuff remotely. And I do have some tips on my YouTube page, for example, how to stop interruptions. And I have to actually do some more of those, is making sure that your body and your voice are not doing things which are shutting people down.
Yes.
So for example, you're not interrupting, you're not mansplaining, you're not doing things with your body in terms of how you're holding your body in space that are making people feel small, like they can't express themselves. You're doing what your viewers may not see it now, but you're nodding your head. A power move that sometimes happens is people don't move their heads when you talk to them. And that's an absolute power move. You're nodding, saying, okay, okay. There are a lot of different things with your physicality and your voice that you can do immediately and actionably that make a huge difference. And I think just believing people and then learning about communication. I mean, you take my book and you learn about what women are dealing with, and you learn about what not to do. Or, you do one of my seminars or whatever, you can actually, that's the beauty of it. And as women, on the flip side of that, we need to work on, unfortunately, because not all men are asking these questions, how do we shut down interruptions? How do we redirect when somebody says, no, this is your fault? Or how do we do this in such a way that we can continue to live our life and not feel like we're constantly swimming upstream and creating a huge conversation? Right. Sometimes you want to have that conversation, but sometimes you just want to do your work and just shut the thing down. You don't have time to hit every single thing.
Yeah. You actually answered the next question I was going to ask, and that was about women, and I love that. And I do want to say, because you alluded to it a bit, and that is, especially for men, the physical presence can oftentimes be the massive brick wall or the open doorway. And I think oftentimes, and again, coming from a male's perspective, I think men don't spend enough time on physical communication, on facial communication. And that is and I will tell you, going back to my experience with teenage girls, after spending years not only raising teenage girls, but working with teenage girls, if you want to work on physical presence, work with teenagers, because they respond to physical presence almost immediately. And you can kind of know, ooh, I did something there that I shouldn't have done. Or, okay, that actually opened the door to conversation. And that's a powerful thing. And especially if for men that are in leadership positions as bosses, there's a lot of, what do they say? 80-90% of communication is actually nonverbal.
Yeah, it's only 7% is what you say.
Yeah, yet we don't work on the nonverbal rarely. And I see leaders and bosses constantly making mistakes that you can see people shrink. I mean, you can cut it with a knife and you can see it physically.
Absolutely.
And yeah, so I think that's powerful. Yeah.
Do I have time to give a tip to people?
Oh, 100%. Please do. This is your show, girl. Do it.
Okay. So I'd like to kind of leave people with a couple actionable things to do. So and this is for women specifically. One of the things that you often hear when you go to talks on communication is to vary your cadence. So go from fast to slow or slow to fast. And the problem with that is that in every conversation, there's a socially acceptable amount of time that you're supposed to talk. So if you've ever been at a party and some person's just going on and everybody's like, you're going to patch your time, friend, like, come on. If you're a boss, you can do that, but everybody else can't. So, but the problem is what they found is women need to, in a professional setting, and actually in most settings, have to offer more evidence to be heard and believed. So a man will say in, his little allotted point of time, I think we should adopt this pen. And the women will say, I think we should adopt this pen because I've done research and there's this red thing and it's red, right? But we actually have to fit more verbiage into the same amount of time. But the problem is that speaking very quickly is a very disempowered speech pattern. So one of the things that I tell women to do is just to practice slowing down. And how you can do that in a professional setting is instead of giving all your evidence, you can say, I think we should adopt this pen. I've done some research, and if you're interested, I'd love to share it.
Yes.
Then you bounce that ball to everybody else. They then bounce it back, and you have a whole nother chunk of time where you can talk about all those things you wanted to squeeze in first. So for women, learning to find those moments where you are slowing down is actually a way of claiming power. And I think that's really, really important. So that's one tip. The other tip is to use silence.
Yes.
Women don't pause nearly as much because we are interrupted statistically more. So but silence is an incredibly powerful tool. You can use it to help you when you're stuck and you don't know what to say. And you can use it to make a point. So one of the things I tell women to do in order to avoid interruption and to utilize silence is just to make sure they're maintaining eye contact while they're doing silence. And then men can help women use silence more by not interrupting during those silent moments.
Right.
Silence is really powerful. Right. So those are two very tiny little tips that, you know, I always like to give little tiny tips for people to kind of walk away with and have something in their back pocket.
Well, you're on my brainwave because that was, again, my next question. So great job. I love to end every show with people giving some advice or tips, and that claiming that space, that power back. And that's what I always try and tell young women, especially, is when you're having this conversation. I even challenge young women to do this with their father figure or their father. And that is just to be courageous enough to go, Dad, I'm learning a new way of communication, and I want to try this. And it's been amazing to hear some teenage girls be able to do that, and the dads that are gracious enough to kind of role play that. And what's funny is, and you actually mentioned this earlier in the show, it actually changes the dad or the male figure more than it does the teenage girl, because it causes dad again to reflect and go, oh, wow, like I need to change some of this. And so to me, when I see a woman claim that space of power in the right way, like we've kind of given some examples of how, when we talked about white feminism and things, they can rob it, but in the way that is within their fullness, I actually believe that it causes males to pay more attention than anything else in the world. Because there is something, I'm going to call it holy and sacred, about a woman claiming that space in her full power, and it is undeniable.
And frankly, we should all have that ability.
100%, yes.
Everybody should be able to claim space, and they should be able to claim space equally and be received with the same level of acceptance and someone hearing them. And regardless of who you are and what gender you are, what race you are, we should all be listening to each other more, I think.
And isn't that the saying that people use often? We all just want to be heard and seen, and that's really the human DNA.
Heard, seen, and believed.
Yes, and believed. I love that. There's a great book by one of my favorite writers, Thich Nhat Hanh, who's a Buddhist monk, and he wrote a book called The Power of Silence. And it is if you haven't read it, if our listeners haven't read it, it will change your perspective on silence, and it'll give you some really key things to do to use the power of silence. Because let's be honest, we have so much noise around us, whether it's talking or television or social media or whatever. I think silence is actually more needed now than potentially ever, whether it's internally or externally.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not very good at silence, which is why I meditate. I force myself to be silent.
Yes.
Like, for 20 minutes a day, I'm gonna shut up.
That's awesome. Hey, Eliza, we're gonna do our fun little game that I do with every guest. It's 5 questions. We do this to close out the show. 5 questions, 1-word answers only.
Oy, okay.
So I did put a pull to it, I know. And then we'll start closing out the show. So are you ready for the 5 questions?
Not at all, but I'm gonna try.
Here we go. First of all, regarding books, do you prefer digital or paper?
Digital.
Coffee?
My publicist is gonna kill me for saying that. But yeah. 1 word, digital.
Coffee or tea?
Tea.
What's your one guilty pleasure in life?
1? Guess that's my answer. 1. See, can you tell I like to think I really never stayed within the lines as a child? I'll find a way out of anything.
I'm the same way. When I was a kid and they told us to color in the box, I'm like, why is there even a box?
What box? Didn't even notice that box.
We're gonna
Okay.
keep that. We're gonna keep that. No, we're gonna keep that answer because I love it. That's my favorite answer to that
Yeah.
question ever.
Well,
One thing you cannot live without.
oh. Hmm. Hmm. Connection.
Nice. And your favorite season of the year?
Summer.
Summer. Nice.
Except the clothes rock and fall. So.
The clothes do rock and fall.
but yeah, if I had to pick, I'd say summer.
That's exactly right. Yeah. Awesome. Eliza, this has been great. Your knowledge and your expertise and your passion has shown through, and I really appreciate you coming on the show and sharing with our guests your message. So thank you.
Thank you so much. This is so much fun. Really. Thank you so much.
And we survived internet issues. We did it.
I know, right? That was crazy. I'm so glad we got through that. That was kind of sketchy.
Yep, we did it. Eliza, tell the people where they can connect with you if you have a particular Facebook, social media platform you want them to connect on, or where would you like them to go?
I'm glad you asked that question, Mitch. So they can go to my website, which is elizavancourt.com. There's no U in VanCort. Everybody puts a U in. So it's elizavancourt.com. And also connect with me on LinkedIn. And if you want to go to my YouTube page, you can. I have some cool stuff on it, but I don't keep up with it. So probably I'd say LinkedIn and my website are probably the best ways to go. There are some people who, and I still have room on my page, who've connected with me personally on Facebook. And as long as you say, I heard about you from Mitch's show, I will say yes, because my professional page on Facebook is just like a graveyard. I've neglected it, and I really like real connection. So I'm just going to keep letting people friend me on Facebook until Facebook says I've hit my limit. So yeah, awesome. I love meeting interesting people there.
Awesome. Yeah, and I'm looking at your website now, elizavancourt.com, and there's actually, for the listeners, there's a LinkedIn symbol in the top right corner. You can click that, and that'll take you to Eliza's LinkedIn page, and you can find her there. Also, brothers and sisters, you can pre-order Eliza's new book, A Woman's Guide to Claiming Space, Stand Tall, Raise Your Voice, and Be Heard. You can find that on Amazon for pre-order, or you can go through, find it also on elizavancourt.com as well. We'll put those in the show notes. Eliza, again, this has been wonderful. Thank you so much. We'll visit a little bit after we stop recording. Brothers and sisters, thank you for listening to the Mitch Gray Show. Be sure to follow us on social media at mgraymedia, Gray. Subscribe to us on YouTube, Mitch Gray Media, and subscribe to the show wherever you enjoy listening to podcasts. I will tell you we're in the middle of changing podcasting platforms, but by the time this show releases, that should be done, so we shouldn't have any issues. But I hope you are well, brothers and sisters. Please, if you are a male listening to this show, do all you can to empower the women around you. It is an honor and a pleasure to be able to do that. If you are a female listening to this show, do all you can to empower yourself and those around you as well. And brothers and sisters, we are in this together. There's no better way to live than to live in unity and to walk alongside each other. So thanks again for listening to the show, and we will talk to you soon.